part 3 of perceiving objects and scenes. We're going to segregate out these objects and talk a little bit about what helps us to perceive scenes and what about scenes helps us to recognize objects. The questions that we're going to ask as we're looking at this object recognition and perceptual organization, part of this is something I alluded to very briefly before of perceptual segregation. How do we determine, how do we figure out what is the figure or the thing that I'm interested in versus what is the ground or background, right? So if we look at this now ubiquitous picture in our world, I've seen way too many times. I don't know how many psychology classes you've had, but this is often presented in a psychology class as an ambiguous figure. And while you might not believe me because it's actually really difficult to keep in one interpretation, but you're flipping back and forth between interpretations. So when you're seeing the vase or the chalice or whatever you call that thing in the middle, the blue part, the dark blue, is a background. It's unformed. The chalice is the thing. It has the outline. It tends to be more memorable. When you're seeing the faces, now they get the outline, and that lighter white area is the unformed background. But again, with this one, it's become, for me, I go back and forth so quickly, it's hard for me to see one kind of as the background, because as soon as I focus on it, it becomes the figure again, and I can go back and forth very quickly. And here is the slide where I usually go through those aspects of figure versus ground with the words on the slide, trying to make it really clear that the figure is in front. It is the thing. It is the thing. It is more thing-like. It is more memorable. I am going to say that that's particular or specific to certain cultures. The outline belongs to the figure, and the ground is more unformed. And you can see this very clearly in this picture if you're looking at the horses in front and you start to see that there are a few extra legs, and then you start to see a horse pop out from what was the background. You'll notice that that was unformed ground, and then it popped out as the figure, similar to how we saw those faces pop out of the forest picture. I have taken this image and this study from Beth Morling's book on research methods, because I think it's a really important point to make and a really fascinating kind of thing, that while we expect a lot of our social psychology or higher level cognition, those kinds of things, to be more different between cultures, what's really interesting is that there are these lower level perceptual aspects of our environment, that how we perceive our environment and how we interpret our environment, that are actually more culture specific or different between cultures. So in this special case of kind of trying to generalize results, something that we've done for decades is to just apply the research that we get mostly in these Western cultures to other cultures. In this study by Matsuba and Nisbet, they were looking at what was remembered from this picture. And I'll ask you, so what do you notice first in this picture? And most of my students say the fish. Every once in a while someone says the plants or that little frog thing at the bottom or something else. So they said that kind of caught my attention. Most of us say that's what we're noticing, right? Is the things in the picture. And so if I asked you what you were most likely going to remember from this picture, it would be those things, right? The objects in the picture. But in this study by Matsuba and Nisbet, they asked, what did you see in this picture? And you can see that for the fish that is the far left picture is the fish that is on the same background in the same place that they saw the fish before. In this case, the Japanese were doing better than the North Americans at saying, yes, I've seen this fish before, or I saw this in the previous picture. If we spin that around, we now have the fish on just a white plain background. Now the North Americans are doing better than the Japanese at saying, yes, I saw this. In this case, this fish, right? That I saw this in the previous picture. And if we put it on that same fish on a new background, fewer people are saying, I saw this, but the North Americans are still have a higher percentage than the Japanese of saying, yes, I saw this before. So it looks like for the Japanese, and this was, I think, part of, this was what the researchers were interested in examining, is this question of the background is really memorable and is as much a part of what they're looking at or noticing or remembering as the objects, as the things themselves. If I ask you which is the figure and which is the background, as we're looking at factors that determine figure versus ground, what is the figure and what is the background in A? How about in B? Okay, we're going to see if your results, it's how you can't tell with a single person, but I do this in my classes, and these results come out in my classrooms exactly as they did for Becerra et al. When we're looking at A, the lower part is taken as the figure, and they did this nicely counterbalanced with different colors on the top and the lower part of the figure. The lower part is seen as the figure more often, not 100% of the time by 100% of the people, but more often. If you think about it, when we're looking at the world, what's down towards the ground tends to be more figure-like, and what's up towards, like above the kind of horizon, that's going to be more like background, like back in the sky and that kind of thing. Whereas when we look at B, it's 50-50. Left and right, we don't have some preference for what is the figure versus the ground. Some properties of objects that appear to determine or help us to figure out or segregate this into figure ground. We're going to look at symmetry, area. We tend to take smaller areas as the figure, and those larger areas as being the unformed background. Orientation, I'm going to tell you that one that doesn't work. That one doesn't work, but it's okay. I'm going to use it anyway. And meaningfulness. We like things that are meaningful to be our objects. So which is the figure? Which do you see as the figure? Red or yellow? You can see that what I'm getting at is the symmetry. That symmetry helps us figure out the figure. And so you may have initially, and a lot of people initially say red, and then I'll have a few people say yellow, and then I'll have someone say, wait, it changes. It changes halfway through, right? On the left side, it's red because those are the symmetrical pieces. And then on the right half, it turns into yellow because those are the ones that become symmetrical. So we can see this effect of symmetry in helping us determine figure versus ground. We tend to take the smaller area as the figure. Is that a plus sign or an X on the left image? You can see the X, right, if you try, but it's easier. I mean, what you tend to perceive that as is the plus sign. What about the image on the right? Is it the plus sign or the X? It tends to look like the X, right? And again, I can tell you it's the plus sign, and you can kind of make yourself see that, but it's easier to perceive it as the X. We're taking the smaller area as being the figure and the larger area as being that unformed ground. And orientation, we tend to take the vertical horizontal, those that we have already seen, that oblique effect that we see, those vertical and horizontal lines longer, right? We can see them better. We have lower thresholds for them. We tend to take them as the figure. And you're going to have to take my word on that. I've never had this one work. It just doesn't work. I haven't found a good replacement for that smaller area. I actually went out and found a replacement that worked from some of these old pictures from Goldstein. But this is, people tend to see this as a pizza pie circle with a bunch of triangles. It just doesn't work, and that's life. Sometimes not everything works. If we get to looking at meaningfulness, which is the figure, the dark or the light? And people say the dark, right? And we can see this kind of looks like ocean waves, and so that's what we're taking as the figure. But I'm going to guarantee you it doesn't have to do with dark versus light, because I can flip that upside down, right? And now it is the light that is the figure, because it's still making the ocean waves. I've just flipped that upside down, and now the light waves are what are meaningful, and so that's what we're taking as the figure. This is one of my favorite ones that tells us the effects of orientation and meaningfulness together. What do you see in this picture? And then what is the background, right? Most of us, you might have already seen it. Sometimes it pops out at you, but most of us take those little black things as the figure, and we see them as, I've had them called Lego men, and I've had them called different things, and people come up with different ideas of what they might be. But if I flip that around, right, so if you look at the one on the right, where you can clearly see the word tie written in white, and now flip that upside down, and now that becomes the figure, right? You can no longer see the weird little Lego pieces. You see the word tie, but it's upside down. And my last one that I come back to is that meaningfulness, familiarity, so much influencing what we see as the figure, that if you think about, so anymore, I've seen this a lot of times, and I don't see the horses and the rider. It's not where my eyes land, and I can see them as the figure if I force myself to. But remember, so when they're the figure, really everything else is the background. But once you start seeing those faces, that meaningfulness, that familiarity, you create these faces, they become the thing, right? They're no longer the background. They are the thing that's memorable, and it's hard to figure out what is the background in this picture, except for those little pieces that don't make up some part of a face. Here are a couple of my favorite things from N.C. Escher. So he was one of those people who liked to play with what is figure and what is ground, and somewhere in the middle it's likely to be very ambiguous to what is figure and what is ground, and then it's going to become unambiguous and clear again, as this was one of the games that N.C. Escher liked to play. And he was at the Columbia Museum of Art one semester when I was teaching. A lot of the times, if I'm including artists, I've seen them at some museum, and a few times it's because I saw them at the Columbia Museum of Art, which gets some really good exhibitions coming through Columbia. And when we look at determining figure from ground, according to Gestalt psychologists, so according to Max Wertheimer, the figure needs to be distinguished from the ground before object recognition really occurs. So we're doing this perceptual organization and applying those Gestalt principles before the object recognition. So if I ask you what you see in A, most people see a W on top of an M. If I ask you what you see in B, some people still really easily see the W on top of the M. Max Wertheimer playing his games of what we see, but a lot of times what we end up, the answer someone gives me is, a design on a tree trunk, or skis with something between them. These things that are where we are using that good continuation and some of those Gestalt principles, and so we're not as likely to see the W and the M as the figure, because we've distinguished figure from ground, applied those principles before object recognition. But I'm going to tell you what's kind of neat to me is that people are still doing research on these questions. So this was actually in 1994, so maybe a while ago now, but still long after the 1911 when we started talking about some of these principles. And again, which principles trump which other principles? I mean, that's all. Some of those are still really open questions. And what does this mean, or when and how would we see individual differences, and when would those come around? When might we as one specific individual be leaning towards one interpretation or another? Is another, I think. Can we push people towards using one or the other? But anyway, in this study by, I think it's Gibson and Peterson, might be Peterson and Gibson, they showed these pictures for about 50 milliseconds, and they had a pattern mask, so the person really isn't consciously seeing the picture, but it's just such a fast flash. That's actually 1/20th of a second, so 50,000ths of a second. What people see, so if they're shown A and they're asked which is the figure, which is the ground, people tend to say the left, the dark side of that picture. If they get the one on the right, in both of these, they're not really consciously seeing anything, but on the one on the right, they're half and half. And so that black figure is taking up half of the screen. There's nothing, the left-right distinction that we saw in the Passera isn't pushing us in either direction. And when the woman's profile there is upside down, it's not meaningful to us. And so it looks like before we do we're doing object recognition more like immediately and then deciding the figure ground is what that research suggests. So this is a nice, one of those open questions that seems like we still need to untangle some things and figure out what is determining how we're interpreting figure versus ground. I'm going to bounce a tiny bit around within the chapter to keep what I can about object recognition, and then talk about scenes kind of separately, given the timing of these videos. So some of this is towards the end of the chapter, and then I'll come back to talking about what I want to about scene perception, this more holistic kind of scene perception, and how that helps us. So most of these chapters, even when we're not going through the basics of here's the pathway and the neural networks and the brain activity and all of that, they'll have some piece or part that really discusses, here, let's look at neural activity here. In this Grill-Spector et al. Study, they had participants see pictures of faces, where one of those faces was Harrison Ford's face. As we're going to see in this example, all of the data that we're going to look at in a minute is that they saw, or what was presented to them was Harrison Ford's face. The other thing they might see is a gradient or random texture. And they're seeing it for about 50 milliseconds, which I just mentioned in the previous couple of slides. 50 milliseconds is 50,000ths of a second. It's a very quick presentation. It's about a 20th. It is a 20th of a second. And so they're making sure that, so in this case, for something like the face, sometimes you're going to consciously see it, but a lot of times you're not going to see anything, because it's really not enough time for conscious perception 100% of the time. And I think this research is really important, especially because I'm going to end up skipping over visual attention, and we're going to see, and we end up seeing a similar kind of effect in brain activity when we talk about attention, because attention is what really brings things into conscious awareness. And so we can have the same thing hitting the sensory receptors, but if I'm not consciously aware of it, then we're really not going to see a great deal of activity, at least at the level of the cerebral cortex and these regions where we're doing this higher level processing. So what we're looking at here, the data, they're all for what's happening when people were presented with Harrison Ford's face. And they're measuring from the fusiform face area. So the fusiform face area was specified for each participant using the MRI, and they're looking at the overall activation of that region, or change in activation of that region in comparison to some control. So the images of what's hitting my eyes right, is the same. It's Harrison Ford's face, but my perception is different. So if they ended up really not even seeing a face, we see the activation of the blue line. So really almost nothing, right? Almost no change. If they saw a face, but they weren't sure of which face it was, we see the neural activity measured is on the orange line. So we see some activation in the fusiform face area. Again, I saw a face, but not as much as when I actually recognize that face. And so I see Harrison Ford's face, I perceive it and consciously recognize it as Harrison Ford's face. That is the red line where we see the most activation in the fusiform face area. Again, this kind of conscious experience, what's happening in the brain is a reflection of our conscious experience, or we might say our conscious experience is a reflection of that neural activity in these different regions of the cerebral cortex of the brain. Another way to look at this neural activity that we see at perception, so where what's happening at our conscious perception is different from what's necessarily happening at the level of the receptors themselves, is with a binocular rivalry kind of study. So this Tong et al. 1998 study is what they call a binocular rivalry study, where binocular, two eyes, rivalry, the two eyes are getting two different images, and so there's this rivalry, if you will. Usually what happens when we have our two eyes open and looking at the world, we're seeing the same world just 6 centimeters apart from each other in those two eyes. But so if I'm presented with one thing to the left eye and something different to the right eye, then we're going to see one consciously, and then we're going to shift over to the other one. That's just kind of what we do. And so this is one of those pictures where the brain is flipped upside down, because that green dot in the brain is the fusiform face area, which is on the right side. And so in this study, they were showing a picture of the person's face to the right eye, because the face is in this kind of green filter and they're looking through a green filtered lens. The left eye, looking through a red filtered lens, is seeing a picture of a house. And so as that person is shifting back and forth and saying, well, now I see the house, we see activation in the parahippocampal place area. When they shift and they're like, okay, now I see a face, we see activation in the fusiform face area. And so again, it's not necessarily the information that's hitting the receptors. What we're seeing in this higher level brain activation is a response to, what am I consciously perceiving right now? Like what am I conscious of?